And we begin tonight with decisive new polling in the Democratic presidential campaign. That polling is decisive only at the lower end of the numbers because of who that polling has eliminated from participation in the next Democratic debate. And today, that polling forced one of the senators in the campaign to drop out of the race. Kirsten Gillibrand tweeted, "Today I am ending my campaign for president. I think it's important to know how you can best serve. Now let's go beat Donald Trump and win back the Senate." Two polls were released today on the final day that candidates could meet the qualifications for participation in the next Democratic debate, which is a combination of polling numbers and the number of donors to a campaign. And it's not necessarily every poll. It's all of the polls taken together. Some individual polls, the candidate can perform lower but still survive the cut for this debate. And that's what's happened here. No candidate, though, appeared to cross the threshold in today's final polls. And so the 10 candidates who have already qualified will be participating in the next debate. A formal announcement by the Democratic National Committee is expected tomorrow on the official lineup of that next debate. The 10 we expect, those 10 candidates we know have already qualified are Joe Biden, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, Kamala Harris, Pete Buttigieg, Amy Klobuchar, Andrew Yang, Beto O'Rourke, Cory Booker, and Julian Castro. A USA Today Suffolk University poll out today shows Joe Biden with a strong lead among likely Democratic primary voters at 32%. Elizabeth Warren is at 14%, Bernie Sanders at 12%, Kamala Harris at 6%, Pete Buttigieg at 6%, Andrew Yang is at 3%, Beto O'Rourke is at 2%, Cory Booker is at 2%, Julian Castro is at 1%, and Tim Ryan is also at 1%, although he did not qualify for the polls. For the debate, every other candidate received less than 1% support in that poll. And a new Quinnipiac University poll shows Joe Biden with that same support level of 32% coming out on the same day. That's among Democratic voters and independent voters who lean Democratic. Elizabeth Warren is at 19%, Bernie Sanders is at 15%, Kamala Harris is at 7%, Pete Buttigieg is at 5%, Andrew Yang at 3%. 8 candidates received 1% support. They are Beto O'Rourke, Cory Booker, Amy Klobuchar, Tulsi Gabbard, Marianne Williamson, Michael Bennet, Steve Bullock, and Bill de Blasio. Every other candidate received less than 1% support in that poll. These polls follow the highly controversial Monmouth University poll released on Monday that showed a virtual three-way tie at the top among Joe Biden, Elizabeth Warren, and Bernie Sanders. Today's polls sharply contradict the Monmouth poll, which many observers considered an unreliable outlier in the polling data when it was released on Monday. And now the director of the Monmouth poll agrees and issued this statement after today's new polls were released. Every so often, you will naturally have a poll that falls outside the standard margin of error. It occurs very infrequently, but every pollster who has been in this business a while recognizes that outliers happen. This appears to be one of those instances. The Quinnipiac poll matched 5 of the Democratic candidates against President Trump. It showed all of those candidates with solid leads over President Trump, with Joe Biden again at the top of the pack. Joe Biden polled 54% against President Trump's 38%. Bernie Sanders is ahead of Trump 53-39. Elizabeth Warren is ahead of Trump 52-40. Kamala Harris is ahead of Trump 51-40. Pete Buttigieg is ahead of Trump 49-40 in the Quinnipiac poll. The front runner in the Democratic race, Joe Biden, had a meeting with a small group of people yesterday. And we are lucky enough to have someone who was in the room with Joe Biden yesterday in that meeting, Nolan McCaskill, who is a political reporter, who described how the meeting was supposed to go and how Joe Biden immediately changed that expectation. Nolan McCaskill's report on the meeting in Politico began this way. Joe Biden's campaign convened a dozen or so black reporters from major media outlets Tuesday for what was offered as a private, off-the-record sit-down with the Democratic front-runner. But Biden opened the discussion, allowing himself to be quoted. And then he started talking, and he talked some more, and before everyone knew it, the former vice president had held forth for 90 minutes. That's an extraordinary amount of time for a major presidential candidate to meet the media in a single sitting. One of the highlights of the discussion was what Joe Biden had to say about how he would choose a vice presidential nominee if he wins the Democratic presidential nomination, and Nolan McCaskill is here to tell us all about that. Here is Joe Biden's latest campaign ad released yesterday in Iowa.
I was sworn into the United States Senate next to a hospital bed. My wife and daughter had been killed in a car crash. And lying in that bed were my two surviving little boys. I couldn't imagine what it would have been like if we didn't have the health care they needed immediately. 40 years later, one of those little boys, my son Bo, was diagnosed with terminal cancer and given only months to live. I can't fathom what would have happened if the insurance companies had said for the last 6 months of his life, you're on your own. The fact of the matter is, healthcare is personal to me. Obamacare is personal to me. When I see the president try to tear it down and others propose to replace it and start over, that's personal to me too. We got to build on what we did because every American deserves affordable health care. I'm Joe Biden, and I approve this message.
Leading off our discussion tonight, three highly experienced political reporters who know how to read today's new campaign polls and who probably thought they had already heard everything Joe Biden has to say about everything, but Nolan McCaskill has a few things to add to that. Nolan McCaskill is a political reporter for Politico. Also with us, Sam Stein, politics editor of the Daily Beast. He's an MSNBC political analyst, and Jonathan Allen's with us. He's national political reporter for NBC News Digital. And Nolan, let's start with you and this extraordinary meeting with Joe Biden yesterday. About a dozen of you, and we're all familiar with that style of meeting. It's supposed to be off the record, and you're supposed to gain some insights about the candidate that might not be possible otherwise. But immediately, I guess Joe Biden put it on the record. Is that how it happened?
It was pretty close. Simone Sanders, his senior advisor, convened us all. And pretty much right before the vice president began to deliver some opening remarks, she informed us that the session would be on the record. And so the vice president ended up speaking for maybe 10 or 15 minutes, delivering his opening statement. And then each of us were offered a chance to ask a question, or sometimes a couple of questions. We were able to squeeze them in. And then about 90 minutes later, the vice president was still talking.
I don't think anyone is surprised at that who knows Joe Biden. 90 minutes is a short run for him. Nolan, what were the highlights of this session to your mind?
I think some of the highlights were the fact that he was very vocal in talking about white supremacy and racism. He was very candid in saying that, racism is a white man's problem. He was challenging white Americans to be vocal about it, to speak out about it, to embarrass it, to really highlight things that are going on that shouldn't be happening in this country, because he says that's the best way to fight it. He also gave some insights into his rationale for determining a running mate should he become the nominee. There's been a lot of pressure, I think, on some candidates, particularly male candidates, to say they would pick a woman, and there's also some pressure to have some diversity on the ticket by choosing a person of color. But the former vice president said while he does prefer to have someone who fits that bill, his priority is to pick someone who's more so aligned with him. He talked a lot about his experience being vice president to President Barack Obama and how much trust Obama had in him when he was in the White House. And he said that that's the most important thing for him if he is to become the nominee, to have someone he trusts, even if that person doesn't necessarily fit the bill of being a woman or being a person of color, although he does really want to consider that. Yeah,
Nolan, as I read your account of it with the quotes of what he said about the VP choice, it did sound like he really wants to go make a diverse choice if he gets to make that choice.
Right. He told us it was his preference to choose somebody who's a person of color or a woman, if not both. But he also seemed to suggest that, he's looking at someone who's possibly more of a moderate, someone who really agrees with him politically. He was telling us that the only disagreement that he's willing to have with someone who's on the same ticket with him is a disagreement in tactics, but he wants somebody who believes the same things he believes so that he can trust that person to delegate the big tasks of the vice presidency, so that he can continue to focus on the big things that a president has to do.
Sam Stein, and then there were 10 on the debate stage. It looks
10.
like it's finally going to be a group that you can actually get on the stage all together at once.
We act like 10's not a little debate stage here. It's right. A lot of people. But no, I think there's a lot of Democrats who are very relieved, in part because 2 nights was just tiresome, but also because at this juncture, it really is incumbent upon the main candidates, the top 5 candidates, to actually be able to debate one another, and that was not happening up until this point. And so what we will see for the first time now is Joe Biden on the same stage with Elizabeth Warren. Now, whether that changes the dynamics here is another question, because still with 10 people, it's an incredibly crowded debate stage. We're talking about, 90 seconds to 2 minutes for answers, tops, with the rebuttals. That's not exactly a substantive debate, but, we will get to see the contrast that we've been longing to see. And in all likelihood, after this debate, the field will narrow even further, naturally or not, and we'll get an even tighter debate stage after that.
Jonathan Allen, so we got the two polls out today, and Monmouth just comes out and says, well, we should all just forget about that Monmouth poll. And people were leaning in that direction already anyway. But there's Joe Biden with this solid 32 it's right back there, and he's right back in that solid position. And everyone else is in an alignment that they've been settled into now for a couple of weeks, with Elizabeth Warren essentially coming in second in these kinds of polls. The rest of the field, the way they've been lining up in most of the other polls. Is this starting to gel, or is this where we still say it's too early?
I think it is still too early, but if you were to come up with the big storyline so far, Joe Biden's resilience as the leader, the front runner, with roughly a third of the Democratic electorate behind him, is certainly number one, and number two would be Elizabeth Warren, really having the trajectory that she's had, coming basically from out of nowhere at the beginning of the campaign, up into that position of second, maybe perhaps having plateaued a little bit for the moment. That would be the sort of second storyline among the candidates. We'll have to see them, as Sam says, on the debate stage for the first time, to see if that rocks anything back and forth. I think one of the interesting things to watch will be Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. We saw them in Detroit essentially locking arms as the people agitating for what Elizabeth Warren calls big structural change, and not going after each other at all. It'll be interesting to see if they try to do that again, with Biden sort of taking the moderate position and how that plays out. He's certainly a stronger advocate for that position than some of the others they were on stage with last time.
Nolan, really striking numbers in the Democrats versus the Donald Trump part of the poll, with Biden with this kind of huge lead. I mean, that's just a huge lead in polling terms, 54-38 over Donald Trump, one-on-one. Bernie Sanders 53-39, just about within the margin of error. That's the same thing. And Elizabeth Warren's 52-40 within the margin of error is the same thing. All the way down to, they only matched this group, Pete Buttigieg, 9 points ahead of Donald Trump. This has to be very encouraging for the Democrats, and actually possibly free up some of that sense that Joe Biden is the safest possible choice.
Right. There's definitely evidence in this polling that Joe Biden isn't the only candidate who can defeat Trump, but he does have to his advantage the fact that he does lead Trump by the largest margins. He does continue to lead the rest of the field by the largest margins. He does well with women. He does well with men. He does well with white voters. He does well with black voters. He does well with Hispanic voters. I think one of the most interesting things in the polling is just the fact that you have this historically diverse field of 2020 candidates, but the top three are older white people who continue to dominate, and that's just a very interesting perspective. But when you talk about who can beat Trump, other candidates are proving that Joe Biden is not the only one.
Yeah, and Sam, there's other polling information about what voters are thinking in terms of disapproval of the president, right. Polls that aren't directly related to where the candidates stand, that show that that the Democrats have a at this stage in the polling, this early stage in the polling, have a very strong advantage over Donald Trump right now. Yeah,
I think judging head-to-head polling at this juncture is a little bit of a fool's errand. Things change dramatically, as you all know. We could look back at how Hillary Clinton was faring against Trump at this juncture in 2016. What struck me about the Quinnipiac poll was not the head-to-head stuff, although it does matter in the perception of who is quote-unquote electable. The number that actually struck me was the number Trump had on the economy. For the first time, voters had a more dismal view about the economic future than a positive one in the Quinnipiac poll. That seemed highly dubious for Trump. He has really held on to this idea that despite all the histrionics, despite all the drama, despite all the controversy and the lack of ethics, that this strong economy, this robust stock market would propel him among voters to a second term. If that starts to slip, if the public begins to start to doubt their economic future, I think Trump's in a real world of hurt. And at that juncture, yeah, you will see Democrats across the board scoring well against him in a general election hypothetical matchup.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.